them, and we have the means to kill them. And in doing so, we don't simply attack civilians or people who are not guilty. And that is really the problem. And it's one thing to talk about a nation like Afghanistan, which is remarkably unpopular and whose leadership have virtually no supporters. And it is quite another to talk about effectively launching another Gulf War against Iraq, a massive war against Iran, or being caught up in any effort that might involve Syria in the middle of a second intifada when we already face the backlash from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Points well taken, Tony. Let me just try to separate a couple of things out before we let you go on this. You're talking on one hand about an issue of morality and how the United States as a democratic nation will behave, and you're at the same time, it seems to me, talking about tactical operation. Let's just talk tactics for a second. If the President of the United States, are you still there? Decided,
yes,
thank you, can't see you. If the President of the United States decided he was going to launch an attack on, quote, the leadership, unquote, of the Taliban, what would be the chances of success? What effect would it have?
Well, if he announces it, there's a very good chance they'd simply disperse.
No, I'm
and
sorry.
We find it almost impossible to find them.
I'm sorry, I take that back. If the President launched an attack, not announced it in public first, of course.
Well, he'd probably have to use aircraft. Cruise missiles aren't really precise or reliable enough. We'd have to put in a major air task force so we could find the target and make sure we could protect the aircraft. To do that, we would have to have some kind of really good real-time intelligence on the ground, because we are talking about leaders that move, and we would have to be sure that in the process we didn't create a political backlash. It's not simply an issue of morality by killing people who are innocent.
Tony,
which means we have to monitor the attack as it occurs.
Tony, the loss within the last several days of one of Afghanistan's leading anti-Taliban militia leaders, is this an enormous loss to the United States in terms of intelligence inside Afghanistan? He was assassinated and we believe has died, according to the reports out of Afghanistan.
Well, it could be, but we don't know as yet whether there is some other leader, and we don't know whether this movement will survive or actually react to this suicide bombing by being stronger. And we just don't know yet, Peter.
Okay, and last question for now. The Russians, so to show we have half our mind in the Cold War today, the Russians have offered cooperation with their intelligence services in Afghanistan, according to congressional sources tonight, talking to Linda Douglas. Is that a realistic suggestion? Can the United States and Russia cooperate in a meaningful way on terrorism?
I think in some ways we already have been, and oddly enough, we have even talked to the Iranians about terrorism in Afghanistan. There'll be real questions about how good the FIS in Russia really is, but certainly they're going to be very careful. Any information they give us, they're going to have been checking out. They're not going to be embarrassed if they can possibly avoid it.
Thank you very much, Tony. I really appreciate it. Tony Kordersman, who's been our longtime military analyst, and I said spends an enormous amount of time producing enormous amount of material for us to absorb on this extraordinarily complicated issue. We're also joined briefly by ABC's Judith Kipper, who is in our Washington bureau as well, and I don't doubt, knowing Judith Kipper, who's worked for us for many years now, that she has been on the phone to every person she knows east of the Mediterranean tonight. What have you learned, Judith?
Well, Peter, it's very interesting. I got a number of emails from friends in the region and journalists and others saying, is the United States now going to take a different tact in the Arab-Israeli conflict? And I was quite surprised by that the first impression was that somehow this would teach us a lesson and that we would be more responsive and more active in trying to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. I think we're really at a crossroads in terms of the Middle Eastern region, if this turns out to be Middle Eastern perpetrators, because it's really going to be a question now of those who really are with us and those who are not, those who can really condemn this, take actions to cooperate, and to move toward eliminating actions against civilians as something that is quasi-acceptable in the region. And it's going to be very hard for a lot of our allies in the Arab world.
And as you listen to as you take the temperature, if you will, of the Middle East today, we've heard people in many of the Middle Eastern nations deeply depressed by this attack. We've heard other people applauded in public. What temperature do you think the thing is running at?
I think people are confused, fearful of retaliation, knowing that more instability and scary things are in front of them. And, you know, the one country that hasn't been mentioned very much is Pakistan, and the U.S. is going to have to reevaluate that relationship if it turns out that this is an Osama bin Laden operation.
Okay, thanks, Judith, very much. Appreciate you coming in as well. You can just feel, I suppose, and sense, as I do, in our coverage that thanks, Judith, very much. Judith Kipper, who's been in our Washington Bureau. We're going back and forth on this story. We have this enormous human tragedy, in one case which we try to cover, and then this enormous challenge to the United States government. The United States is a nation, but the United States government, and what the United States is going to do about it. What does it know at this point, which appears to be very little. But this tendency, fueled somewhat by the analysts who study the history of international terrorism and by a couple of observations by Senators Graham of North Carolina tonight, and Senator Edwards of North Carolina and Senator Hatch of Utah today, that the CIA at this point has picked up in its monitoring of telephone conversations post the attack some contact between supporters of Osama bin Laden. And it makes sense in most everybody's mind that on an occasion like this, Osama bin Laden is one of the prime suspects, just based on the history of the whole thing. And it's also probably very important for us to remember, as Judith Kipper points out, that the United States in the region and in the Muslim world generally is seen very much as a staunch and unswerving and sometimes indiscriminating ally of Israel. So there are Palestinians and people in the Arab world tonight who believe that if they punish the United States, they're punishing Israel. If they punish the Israelis in their conflict with the Palestinians at the moment, it's also important to punish the United States. But let us come back now to the immediacy of the tragedy. WCBB, ABC's station in Boston, reports tonight that one car has been taken away from Logan Airport in Boston, which there is they want to know whether or not this was a vehicle that was used by one of the people who hijacked an American Airlines or United Airlines plane out of Boston today. Let me just read quickly what it says. We are able to report that it was a Mitsubishi Mirage. It had Virginia plates. We haven't got the license plate number yet. FBI Forensics has the car at an off-site garage. It was actually towed by the state police. Included in the 6 bags of evidence confiscated by the FBI were chairs that the suspected terrorist may have sat in at the airline terminal, and the FBI hopes to pull DNA off the seats in the airport. And there again you see an advance in science in terms of investigating innocence and criminality. We see it in the prison system in the country as a whole, and we see the FBI bringing to bear very quickly the notion that DNA may be a clue here. But as we know, these terrorists got on 2 of these planes in Boston, which were intended to make transcontinental flights, and hijacked both of them and headed for New York City. And Logan Airport officials now confirm that reporting from ABC's affiliate in Boston, WCBB. And then the officials at Logan Airport, probably reflecting what's going to happen at a lot of airports around the country now tonight. The director of aviation there, Tom Kenton, said he expects that what we're going to get at Logan Airport, and certainly others around the country, is very quickly instituted a measure of security at the airport similar to that which was in place during the Gulf War. Much greatly reduced access to the side of the airport, and much greatly reduced access for people to the passenger areas, unless they're flying, and there'll be identification checks. In other words, all of the things that the country had to become accustomed to through the Gulf War may now be put in place again. And we'll get some sense of that when the Congress meets again tomorrow, because we know they're going to pass legislation which will, in the first instance, undoubtedly be in support of the president, who gets very high marks from a lot of people today for that speech that he made in the White House tonight. And beyond the support for the president, there will be legislation, we don't doubt for a second, introduced very quickly to increase the number of resources which are available to counterterrorism in the United States, to some urging of a better coordination among federal agencies and a greater legal authority. It's the dangerous one, perhaps, in the minds of many Americans, more legal authority for federal agencies to impose on people's freedoms in the country in order to conduct this campaign, this investigation against terrorism. And you saw in our poll tonight that many people agreed it was worth giving up some of their freedoms, at least in the short run, according to a very quick snap poll we took, if it aided the investigation. Back to the people themselves. ABC's Lynn Scher, who spent an early part of the day very focused on the aircraft and the passengers, has now, I think, Lynn, put together a piece for us on what we do know about people who have been victims today.
Peter, that's right. You remember what President Bush said a little bit earlier today. He said the victims were in airplanes in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Well, here are some of who they were.
Olson, former federal prosecutor, more recently a TV commentator, was on American Flight 11 that left Dulles Airport for Los Angeles. She was also the wife of U.S. Solicitor General Ted Olson. Mrs. Olson called her husband on a cell phone to report that the plane had been hijacked and that at least 2 men had herded the passengers into the rear of the plane. She asked her husband what she should do. Then the plane crashed into the Pentagon. David Angel of Pasadena, California, was one of the creators of Frasier, the TV show. He and his wife Lynn were on American Flight 11 from Boston, the one that crashed into the first World Trade Center tower. There were at least 2 highly placed computer executives among the victims. Daniel Lewin, age 31, was co-founder and chief technical officer of Akamai, an internet infrastructure company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He leaves a wife and 2 sons. Edmund Glazer, 41, of Chatsworth, California, was an executive at MRV Communications, a leading California fiber optics company. He, too, was on the Boston to Los Angeles flight, and he leaves a wife and son. There were 2 prominent members of the professional ice hockey community. Garnet Ace Bailey, director of pro scouting for the Los Angeles Kings hockey team, once a star player himself, was on United 175 headed from Boston to Los Angeles. Ace Bailey was 53 and is survived by his wife and son. On the same flight was Mark Bavitz, an amateur scout for the LA Kings. We know some of the crew members' names on that flight. Al Marchand was a flight attendant from Alamogordo, New Mexico, a former police lieutenant who went to work for United after retiring from police work. He wanted to be a pilot. The man who was the pilot of that flight was Victor Saraceni of Lower Makefield Township, Pennsylvania. A neighbor described him as a great guy with a wife and 2 children. "I'm sure," said the neighbor, "he fought to the end." The pilot of American 11, the first plane to hit him, is a great guy with a wife and 2 children. "I'm sure," said the neighbor, "he fought to the end." The pilot of American 11, the first plane to hit the World Trade Center, was John Oganowski, 52, of Massachusetts.
And there are more, of course, many, many, too many more. The airlines are not releasing complete passenger manifests yet, citing security reasons. We'll be hearing a lot more of those names tomorrow. Peter?
Thanks, Lynn, very much. Giving personality and life, in essence, or personality to the people who were involved in these disasters today. And we'll run that piece again, I think, fairly soon now, because we've been so slow for all the obvious reasons and so unable to attach lives and personalities and families and connections to the people who have suffered and died in these instances. So that's a big step forward. Thanks very much, Lynn. Just 2 remarks quickly about that piece. There was a lot of focus there on Dennis Potvin, who goalkeeper in that game there for Colorado at the moment, and it was not Dennis Potvin, even though you saw a lot of him and his jersey there. It was not Dennis Potvin we were talking about as a victim on one of those aircraft today. And ABC's Pierre Thomas, who covered the FBI and was the first person to raise with us here today the value of the passenger manifests in terms of trying to focus on the perpetrators of this themselves, has proven to be extremely valuable. You hear from Logan Air Base and from Boston tonight that the FBI is all over the airport, all over the car, all over a car that may have been used by the terrorists today. in order to give personalities and connections to them as well. So the investigation inches forward. And for the country as a whole, I think some time ago, several hours ago, we ran a fairly lengthy piece which we had put together, which was just simply scenes of today. We take no pleasure in reviewing these scenes for you time and again, except trying to get you closer to the reality of what has actually been happening on the ground. But this has been one of those days when news agencies share information. It's a competitive world, but we have shared information today, giving each other access to material which has helped the country get closer to what has happened. And this is the most recent piece that we get courtesy of CNN, yet one more angle on the attack on the Trade Center today. We have seen that earlier today from a freelance photographer who shot it down below. I must say this air marshal program is very much in existence in the Middle East. I think everybody who pays any attention to air travel knows that El Al, the Israeli airline, is one of the most secure airlines on which to fly. Other airlines of Arab nations at various stages have certainly had armed security on board. I once flew on a Royal Jordanian aircraft from Jordan to Beirut, which is only 50 minutes away. Somebody made a flip observation about hijacking, and within seconds we all had semi-automatic weapons pointed at our heads by security officials who appeared from nowhere. So in various parts of the world, so certainly true on Soviet and subsequently perhaps on Russian airlines, security is present or not present, depending on the mindset of the government in question at the time. But there's always been something of a feeling that the risk to passengers was huge if there was going to be a gunfight on board an aircraft involving terrorists, hijackers, and an otherwise innocent traveling public. So it's been a fairly controversial program almost since the beginning. I want to talk now to our principal aviation analyst, John Nance. We've talked to John several times today. Remind me, John, you're also in Seattle, right? Now, where are you?
That's correct. Tacoma, actually.
You're in Tacoma, in Washington, which I think is your home, as I recall. And I've seen subsequent reporting today which confirms that which you were so eloquent about this morning, or so particular about this morning, that it is not very difficult to fly a 757 or a 767, or at least on the short-term basis to get an aircraft directed where you want it to do, even if you're a rank amateur. Can you go through that again for us?
Yes. I missed the last part of the question.
Well, just how,
Peter, I'm sorry.
I apologize, windy question, but that it is possible, without a great deal of experience, to get a 757 or a 767 to go where you want it to go, even if you're an amateur, if you're going to go a short distance, that these are basically easy and similar aircraft to fly.
Once it's in the air, that's correct. However, when you take a look at the picture of the 767 going into the building there in the World Trade Center, Peter, what you see is an aircraft that's in a bank that's being manipulated rather deftly to get it right on target. And the fact that we had both these airplanes hit on target suggests to me that we had fairly experienced pilots of one sort or another in that terrorist group at the controls of that airplane. But is it possible that they could be more amateurish and just guiding it maybe with the experience only in a single-engine aircraft? Yes, it is within the realm of possibility.
I think I heard one airline captain say today that with 3 or 4 months experience only, you could actually get a license which would qualify you to fly one of these aircraft, or at least, as he said, it's very, very easy to aim the plane.
It is, if you've had some experience on the controls. It does not feel like a small single-engine aircraft, so there is a bit of a difference there. But I think what I would come back to is this, that if somebody were planning to do this, and obviously somebody planned very well, they're not going to want to take a chance that maybe somebody isn't going to, the person at the controls that they put there, their terrorist, is not going to hit the building. They're going to want some training, and that's where I think we can probably follow that string. There's something else that, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk about that you brought up a little while ago, and I thought it was very interesting. You're talking about Flight 93 and the question about why it went down there in Pennsylvania and that we don't know the cause, and the fact that, of course, the government says, the military says tonight that they did not shoot it down. there are still two possibilities, and we don't really have a clear track on this. One, the Associated Press reported several hours ago that in one of the cell phone calls from that airplane, from a passenger, the passenger was talking about the circumstances of the hijacking, and at a certain point he said, wait a minute, there's a puff of smoke out on one of the wings, or a puff of white smoke, and then he said, we're going down. Exactly what sequence that's in, I don't know, but apparently that call was made to a 911 center, and I assume that we'll be able to get that later on. Now, if that's true, that's a very great puzzle, Peter, because there is nothing that you can do in the cockpit that's going to create a puff of smoke on the wing, and that raises the possibility of some outside force, i.e. a fighter shooting at it. By the same token, we have this as the only one of the four airplanes that made a sudden turn and requested a change in direction. The other three, according to Lisa, we don't have any information that they made any request of air traffic control. The fourth one did. And that would indicate possibly, it could have been one of the hijackers, but it indicates possibly that one of the pilots was allowed to stay functional long enough to agree to take the plane back to Washington. He would not have had any idea what they were going to do or wherever it was headed. And that at some point in time, that still remaining pilot or pilots got into a fight, and that could have led, very much as in Egypt Air, to a tussle in the cockpit which lost control. So we've got really a dichotomy.
Just remind people about Egypt Air. There's a long debate about whether Egypt Air crashed as the willful act of a pilot. Was there a struggle on board with the Egyptian pilot trying to force the aircraft down, other people trying to resist? It is possible that in every instance today there was a struggle in the cockpit before someone got their hands on the controls and went directly for their targets.
And I think I'm not only echoing my own feelings, but also that of the NTSB when I say that the Egyptian government, to the contrary notwithstanding, there really is no other scenario whatsoever that fits the Egypt Air disaster of over a year ago, except that the first officer intended to put that airplane into the water, and ultimately, despite the efforts of the captain to stop him, succeeded.
Now, in terms of access to the cockpit today, it is, you know, we all get on airplanes and we go over, and we now know that in this age, the cockpit door is always locked. The stewardess goes up and has a code, knocks 2 or 3 times, or whatever she does, sometimes has a punch-in security code in order to get the door open. Not difficult to bust through that door, though, if you're determined enough.
No, it isn't difficult, Peter, and the reason that it isn't is because if we made that door too sturdy and we ended up with a rapid decompression, would cause structural problems to the airplane. As a matter of fact, in some of the doors in some of the aircraft, like 737s, there are actually pressure blowout panels on the door that would respond to a pressure change. And those could be, in certain circumstances, removed more easily than we'd like. You can't put a bank vault door up there. Part of the problem is simply the pressure vessel of the aircraft. So a determined individual is going to be able to get through that door. And we've had 2 instances, as a matter of fact, in the past number of years where big, burly people, both of them deranged in one form or another, broke through just with the force of their own body. I think both of those instances were in 737s.
John, you have worked so many investigations for us over the years, and you have the added advantage that few people do, being a commercial airline pilot, and know what it's like in the cockpit. And in so many instances, we've actually resolved the issue of what has happened. Ultimately, we've learned what we really believe happened. What's your instinct about today? Are we ever going to learn what really happened on board those airplanes?
Peter, I think we will, at least in 2 of the 4 cases. I think the one in Pennsylvania is going to yield the voice recorder and the cockpit, or the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder rather easily, given the confined condition of the crash site. I think because of the Pentagon situation, we will find those recorders as well. There is so much debris on the World Trade Center site. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to be simply fortuitous if those recorders are covered anytime soon. I think eventually they will be, but probably not soon. And when they are, they're able to withstand a tremendous amount of force and heat and all sorts of disastrous impacts. So I would say that we probably eventually will know precisely what went on in terms of voice in that cockpit
and
in all 4 cases.
I apologize for the interruption. Does this apply to the cockpit voice recorder or just to the black box recorder which records the mechanical goings-on of the aircraft?
Both, actually. They're both in the same location. They're powered the same way. They are in 2 separate orange boxes in the tail end of the airplane, and they both have the same degree of survivability.
That was the question I wanted to answer. The cockpit voice recorder does have the same degree of survivability as do the black boxes, which have time and again revealed information about tragedies in the air.
Not only that, Peter, but some of the later models are actually solid state. They don't even have any moving parts, and they can withstand, I believe it's up to 800 G-forces.
Okay, John, anything you want to add at this particular point?
Well, I guess one thing that's probably a little bit out of the area of expertise, but just to echo some of the other things that have been said today, you know, this is an attack on the United States, but it's also an attack on humanity. I feel this very greatly in several different veins, not only as a citizen, but as an Air Force officer, a reservist, and certainly as a member of the airline community, which has been so sorely represented in this fiasco. And I guess one other thing, if you'll permit me, Peter, and that was about the comments that we've made in regard to security. This is something that a lot of us have known about and quite frankly been very upset about for a long time, is that if we're going to have screening in our airports, and we're going to make the pretense that this is going to be a useful thing, and we don't know whether or not they got through the screening or they plan to go through it or not. We don't know whether there was a failure or if this is simply the system. But we need to have federal employees, in my opinion, not scattered bunches of employees working for different airlines who are paying bottom dollar. We need a standardized, well-trained federal force of people. If we're going to do it, we need to standardize it nationwide. And this has really been, and I'm sorry, but I have to use the word, an absurd excuse for a system for a long time. That's without reference to whether or not that had anything to do with today's terrorist attacks. In other words, whether people got past that system or not.
John Nance, thank you very much. It is very difficult. Thank you very much, John. It is just simply difficult and very much out of the ordinary for commentators, analysts, reporters to step outside the roles they have to and do on occasions like this. And I think John Nance speaks for a great many people who are covering this story today or having to analyze the various dimensions of it. You want to stand outside it and be a human being for just a moment and say what you feel about this, and our jobs do tend to mitigate against that. Now, we've some other elements of the country that we want to pick up. At first, I want to go downtown to Bill Blakemore, downtown New York, I mean, where Bill is still there. Bill, just bring us up to date on the latest that you know.
Well, Peter, we're finally beginning to see a great deal of movement with the search and rescue operations. There's been an enormous amount of traffic going past us here. Here's another ambulance coming out. We've seen heavy machinery moving in and out. They're beginning to move some of the rubble around the periphery of the base of the trade towers. And there's a little bit of good news. Mayor Giuliani has said that they pulled 2 Port Authority police officers alive from the rubble. That was a short while ago. But that's around the edges of the base of the trade towers. We can also see that there's still a fair amount of smoke and heat coming from what was left of the base of the trade towers themselves, and they're still trying to cool that down. It'll be morning before they can get any closer to that. We've been watching a number of the rescue workers moving past us here, some of them looking completely exhausted and covered with dust. One was telling a small crowd here just a short time ago how depressing it was to dig down through 10 feet of ash and come to nothing more but more twisted metal, which we can see down here at the end of the street. Sometimes when the smoke clears, there's still 1 or 2 buildings on fire. However, the beginning of the search and rescue operation is underway, and the morning should reveal a lot more.
Okay, Bill, thank you very much for that contribution, making the point that it's taken 12 hours, more than 12 hours, before the search and rescue operation can really get underway in earnest. And when dark settled over New York City, days, as we pointed out, getting shorter in every part of the country now, lights were brought in from New Jersey and from Connecticut so that that eerie atmosphere that you've seen on prior disasters, though never one of this magnitude in the country and in others, begins to take hold. But it does enable search and rescue operations to go on through the night, and the National Guard, I think it was the Air National Guard from New Jersey, brought in a lot of lights to the New York scenes. Meanwhile, we try to have some appreciation of the mood elsewhere in the country, as well as here. But just take a look. Look at the faces and the demeanor of these people who have worked in a state of their own shock, perhaps, and beyond them in the distance tonight. It'll be very hard for any of us to forget that last skeletal piece, looking like a piece of architecture, which of course it is, there in the distance as the shifts change tonight, of the front of one of the trade towers. It's the only thing that is left standing, to the best of our knowledge, is a piece of the building which is at one of its entrances on the west side of the building facing the Hudson River, that last skeleton of the doorway, of the main doorway that stands there, stretched out into the night as this reminder of all of the tragedy that occurred behind it and now below it. That's what it looked like this morning on the right, and that is what it looked like before the sun set here in New York today. Let's go to Chris Bury, who has reported today on the mood in Memphis, Tennessee.
Like so many places, this city of just under 1 million along the Mississippi River was in mourning and on edge. Downtown, the city's tallest buildings were evacuated just in case. Government offices closed early. Even Beale Street, the famous Memphis strip of jazz and blues joints, was all but deserted.
It was all just scary to me. And thinking about Memphis being, to me, a major city, I mean, could we be next?
Here at the Memphis airport, a major regional hub for Northwest Airlines, hundreds of stranded passengers had been diverted from other destinations. Indeed, many of them were in the air, on their way to other cities when the planes they were in were ordered to land here at Memphis.
So we landed and actually got to the gate before we really knew what was going on. And they'd assured everybody that everybody was safe and the plane was okay and we were in no danger, but they did not tell us why we were being pulled from the air.
With all domestic air traffic shut down, every single terminal screen here told the same story. In Memphis alone, more than 500 flights were canceled. The airlines scrambled to find enough buses for passengers headed to cities as far away as Dallas and New Orleans. Home of Federal Express, Memphis normally handles more air cargo than any place in the world. Now its planes are frozen on the field, awaiting trucks to carry their contents. The tragedies touched Memphis in more personal ways, of course. This woman's cousin works at the World Trade Center.
I was at work when I heard, and we turned on television ahead, and been trying to call ever since, and the lines are busy, can't get any word, from anybody, so. And, I mean, when I saw the first tower go down, I just started crying because I knew.
So even Memphis, so geographically removed from New York and Washington, clearly felt the aftershocks, driving home the point that no American city is an island in today's reign of terror. Chris Bury, ABC News, Memphis.
The perfectly apt closing reminds us, as we've said so many times today, that this is a national tragedy, and Chris Bury reminding us, and many people may have thought it when the entire aviation system came to a halt today, of course, that FedEx is this important hub for FedEx aircraft that travel all over the country. Much of the FedEx material, as do other transportation services, mail services, go through a central hub. And this is a reminder of the economic effect on the country today, because as Lisa Stark told us a little while ago, the Federal Aviation Administration is not going to let the aviation system get up and running again in the United States. And this may also apply to Canada, though we're not sure at this point until some point about noon tomorrow. Our coverage on ABC News and at abcnews.com and in radio will continue. We're going to have a quick change of shift here, but ABC News coverage will continue, period. Thank you very much. I'm Peter Jennings. Elizabeth Vargas is here. Elizabeth Vargas.
This is an ABC News special report.
So Elizabeth Vargas is going to take over the anchor chair here for a spell while teams of our reporters and I go away and try to
It's much needed.
Well, it's not the rest issue here, quite frankly. It's important to get away and appraise what is happening in the country from a broader perspective than just sitting here, as you will find in the next several hours. But thank you very much. And thank everybody else at ABC News who's made a contribution to our understanding today. And we're all in awe of the effort that the firefighters and the police are making, military is making at the Pentagon. So you,
indeed,
yeah, you've seen it from the outside. Now you have to work it from the inside. Thanks,
thank
Elizabeth,
you,
very much.
This is, as Peter just said, ABC News continuing coverage of that terrorist attack on the United States. I am Elizabeth Vargas, and the grim task of searching for victims of the attack on New York's World Trade Center is continuing around the clock. Trade Center, ABC's Bill Blakemore joins us live from Lower Manhattan. Bill, have they been able to extricate any victims, any survivors so far from this wreckage?
Well, we understand from Mayor Giuliani that they have pulled out a couple of Port Authority police officers who were trapped in the wreckage. That was a little bit earlier this evening. And we have seen a great deal more of activity here this evening from the large search and rescue operations that have been staging here throughout the day. We've seen a great deal of heavy machinery moving up and down here as they're beginning to move some of the rubble from around the outsides of the base of the trade towers. But as perhaps you can tell from the scene behind me there, there's still a great deal of smoke and dust coming up from the base of the trade towers themselves. People just coming just now told us it's still on fire there. So there's still a great deal of problem with heat in the center of the scene. And a couple of buildings around the edge are also still on fire. They're starting their search and rescue operations with a little bit of good news on the periphery, but there's still basic problems before they can get the full operation underway.
Buildings in the area were still safe. Have they been able to establish if, in fact, everything is stable in that area?
In fact, we're still hearing reports that a couple of buildings appear that they may not be stable, that something else could still come down. There's a couple of areas the police are making sure nobody is getting near. There's an enormous logistics problem because of all of this heavy machinery down here. The lights are out, and on the dark streets to the left and to the right of me here, every now and then we see large motorcades of big machinery moving by with their lights as the people coordinating this try to get the right machinery in the right place. But beyond that, they're really waiting for morning, which is a few hours away yet, before they can really see clearly what the devastation is.
And I know that must be an incredibly eerie sight down there. We've been seeing some pictures coming into our newsroom here of the smoke, of the wreckage, of the flames. Can you describe what that's like?
Well, eerie is indeed the right word. We have the acrid smell in the air of smoke. The dust is just everywhere and settling more and more on the outlying streets around here. Because they've had to turn off the gas and the electricity in the center of town here for firefighting reasons, there is this bizarre warlike feel. There's only the harsh light that comes from the floodlights that they've managed to move in. Beyond that, we have tired, exhausted groups of rescue workers and policemen standing around, some of them who've come out, some of them waiting to go in.
Thank you so much for that report. Stay there, stay tuned. We'll be checking back with you in just a few moments. There were two attacks, as we've been telling you. One was at the World Trade Center. The other was at the Pentagon. And despite heavy damage at the Pentagon, it is scheduled to open today, even as officials deal with what appears to be a staggering death toll. ABC's Jim Sciutto is live at the Pentagon. Jim, they've already updated it from 100 to possibly 800 fatalities.
Well, Elizabeth, there have been a lot of estimates of casualties, but there was a press conference here with the Arlington fire chief a short time ago, and he actually backed off that 800 figure. Earlier in the day, he'd given an estimate of between 100 and 800 dead possibly here at the Pentagon, but he said a short time ago that 800 figure is a high-end estimate, that really all they know now is that 67 people who were on that plane definitely died. From there, they're really just speculating at this point. The Pentagon is still on fire. Just a few moments ago, we saw flames breaking through the roof of the Pentagon as the firemen do what is called trenching, where they break open the roof to get access to the flames. When they do that, it provides more oxygen. The flames jump up. But you can see them again behind me now spraying the roof with water. As you mentioned before, though, this is still an active building. We received a call just about a half hour ago from someone in the Joint Chiefs of Staff Crisis Action Team, and he said just on his team there are 500 to 1,000 people at work right now in the building. And tomorrow morning the Pentagon is going to be open for business. A small part of it, about a third of the building, is going to be closed off, but still it's going to be in business tomorrow, and it is in business right now, people working. They say that the search and rescue for victims is being suspended now while they try to control the flames, one, and two, make the building safe, because this is an unsteady building. They're peeling away the layers to make sure that the search and rescue workers are not in danger as they look possibly for survivors. The fire chief saying again in this press briefing that he still has hope that there are survivors inside, but he says that it could take as long as a week, search and rescue and also search and recovery of any bodies. Elizabeth.
All right, Jim Sciutto, stand by. We'll check in with you as the evening progresses as well, or the morning now. As Americans watched in horror yesterday, so did most of the other people around the world. ABC's Jim Wooten has the view from overseas.
As word moved across the Atlantic to here in Europe and beyond, the first focus was on Afghanistan, where officials of the Taliban government not only condemned the attacks, but insisted for whatever it's worth that Osama bin Laden is forbidden to use the country as a base for terrorism, and is in no position to do so, though he's believed to have planned previous terrorism from there. In the Middle East,
we are completely shocked, completely shocked.
Yasser Arafat offered condolences from the Palestinian people to America, a sympathy not shared by more militant Palestinians in Jerusalem or these Muslims celebrating in Lebanon. Generally, from leaders of Palestinian militant groups, there were denials of responsibility, but condemnations of U.S. policy in the region.
We call upon the American administration to review their attitude and their policy towards the Palestinian question, because this policy arouses the anger and the hatred of our people.
Russian President Vladimir Putin extended his condolences, then at U.S. request canceled major military maneuvers by the Russian Air Force. There was heightened security at American embassies around the world, including Berlin, where German citizens brought flowers to the gates as a memorial, and as air traffic into and out of London's Heathrow Airport was delayed, flights to the U.S. were canceled indefinitely, British Prime Minister Tony Blair had this to say.
This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world today. It is perpetrated by fanatics who are utterly indifferent to the sanctity of human life. And we, the democracies of this world, are going to have to come together to fight it together and eradicate this evil completely from our world.
That was ABC's Jim Wooten on the worldwide reaction to what happened yesterday. Osama bin Laden quickly emerged as a prime suspect in this attack, and Senator Orrin Hatch says intelligence officials told him people on at least one of yesterday's airplanes appear to have been associated with Osama bin Laden. U.S. officials have long feared what bin Laden might do. Here's ABC's Brian Ross with more.
Commercial airlines have been a part of many of the terrorist schemes tied to today's prime suspect, Osama bin Laden. According to federal court records filed by prosecutors in New York, terrorists working for bin Laden have often received training as pilots, some with U.S. pilots' licenses for large jets. In fact, some pilots say the turn the second plane seems to have made in hitting the World Trade Center would be difficult for an amateur to carry out.
I think we have to start looking for people who were trained to fly these things, people who knew what they were doing, because no pilot would ever fly in and destroy everybody.
As for bin Laden, after tracking him through his cell phone for several years, American intelligence officials reportedly lost track of him last year.
People at NSA told me that they had been able to eavesdrop on Osama bin Laden for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden it all went silent. They weren't able to track him anymore.
Federal prosecutors say bin Laden has a pattern of making good on his threats, and just 3 weeks ago, the Middle East Broadcasting Company reported the latest warning from bin Laden and his followers that the coming weeks would bear significant surprises during which American and Israeli interests worldwide would be targeted.
Men must send their sons to the battlefields and the fighting quarters so that they can be prepared militarily for the religion of Muhammad to triumph.
That was 3 weeks ago in the Afghan desert. Brian Ross, ABC News, New York.
We are going to turn now to pictures of the search and rescue operations underway at this moment at the site of the collapsed World Trade Center towers, as close to ground zero as our crews can get, where hundreds, perhaps thousands of emergency workers are braving extraordinarily dangerous conditions to fight fires and to search for any signs of life. We have heard reports that a number of survivors have been, in fact, pulled from the rubble. Other reports we've been getting in are that people were actually trapped inside some of that rubble and were using cell phones to call 911, to call for rescuers, to call for help. As you can see, an eerie scene in lower Manhattan. There is no electricity in much of this area. The area is lit by portable floodlights that they have brought down. Whole blocks worth of bulldozers and trying to clear away this wreckage. It could take weeks, however, they say, to find out the exact number of victims in this disaster. We're going to Bill Blakemore, who is down at the ground zero where the crews are working so diligently, so hard to try and find any victims, any survivors. Bill, what kind of progress are they making?
We haven't heard of any other than 2 or 3 people being pulled from the rubble so far. There have been a number of the search and rescue workers who've worked their way back up here after their shift ended, covered with dust, who've talked about how depressing it is to try to dig through 10 feet of ash and rubble and then just find another bit of metal and then have to start all over again, finding nothing. The really sobering thought, of course, Elizabeth, is the fact that down there at the end of the street is where all of the bodies are lying. We don't know how many it is, that people are saying could be in the tens of thousands.
This can often be a very delicate task in cases like this. The wreckage itself could collapse at any moment. How difficult a job is this, and how hard is it to even get close to some of this wreckage?
Well, first of all, a couple of buildings around the edge of it are still burning, and we can see some of the smoke still piling up from some of those fires. Some of that, of course, is also dust from some of the demolition work as they're trying to get some of the debris cleared away. So they've got that difficulty. They've also got the difficulty of the fact that the trade towers seem to have completely disintegrated, virtually completely disintegrated as they fell down upon themselves. There's almost nothing left of any of the floors. So they have a great density of wreckage as well.
All right, Bill Blakemore, thank you so much for that update down at ground zero at what was the World Trade Centers and what is now the scene of a massive crime scene and a terrible national tragedy. It was United Airlines Flight 93, and passenger Mark Bingham was able to call his mother on a cell phone from a locked bathroom to tell her that the plane was being hijacked. Bingham's mother, Alice Hoglund, spoke earlier with Peter Jennings.
He said, "I just wanted to let you know that I love you." He was repeating that the same thing he had told Kathy a moment before. I told him, "We love you, Mark." And he said, "I'm on a flight, flight 93, United Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco, and there are 3 guys that have taken over the flight, and they say they have a bomb. And I'm calling you from the airphone on the plane," meaning not his cell phone, I guess. I found out since that he was sitting in the last part of first class and that the flight was fairly light, not very many passengers, 45 people aboard. So he may well be able to take a proactive part in that, and he intended to do is target. I certainly hope so, anyway.
Ms. Hoglund, I hate interviews like this at this moment, and I'm sure you are suffering in ways that we cannot imagine. Did your son say anything else to you about the circumstances on board the flight?
No, I wasn't able to be. He was cut off. Can you hear me all right?
I can indeed.
The plane, the phone went dead after a few seconds. I got the impression that he was being distracted badly by something going on around him. I didn't hear anything except the sort of confusion. I didn't hear any explosions, any yelling, just voices, and then he seemed quite distracted about being a quite calm voice, so was a very close fellow, and then repeated that he loved us. He emphasized to me that what he was telling me was true. I told him I believed him, that we loved him, and the phone went dead.
Terrible, terrible news from the mother of Mark Bingham, one of the passengers on board one of the 4 commercial airline jets that were hijacked this morning. several of those passengers on many of those airplanes were in fact able to use their cell phones. Many of them were reported on the phone when they called loved ones that they had been hijacked. Many of them had been herded to the back of the plane. They reported to loved ones that hijackers had, in many cases, attacked, stabbed flight attendants with knives that they had somehow managed to bring on board, something that is now going to be, the FBI will investigate as a tremendous security breach. That later on, in one case, the pilot of the aircraft was taken to the back of the airplane, according to some reports, but several people were able to, in those terrifying moments when I'm sure they knew something very terrible was on its way to happening, were able to call somebody, loved ones, on their cell phone and talk with them. In fact, there's been a lot of talk already on why on earth we didn't have any clue, apparently, that these attacks were going to happen. Something this well orchestrated took an enormous amount of planning and preparation by whoever is behind this attack. And there's already a lot of finger pointing going on about why we didn't get any sort of clue this was about to happen.
A lot of the intelligence professionals are saying the United States is the best in the world at technical intelligence gathering, scooping up information from the sky, in effect, but not so good nowadays in human intelligence. That is, people on the ground, informants on the ground. And I think that's going to be a lot of what you're hearing in coming days here.
And in fact, the way we fly in this country could change dramatically. Security, that sort of thing, that changes that could be happening at the airports?
Security is going to change once they resume flights, which could be as early as noon today. There's certainly, you won't be able to check in bags at curbside anymore. There's going to be a lot more security all along the way, including some random ID checks.
All right, Barry Serafin, thank you for checking in with us from our nation's capital. Recapping, any update, any more survivors found?
Not that we know of so far. The big problem is an enormous amount of dust and the fact that they still cannot get the fires out. We can see against the dark night sky the smoke coming from two of the large buildings that are just to the west of the trade towers. They've been burning all day. We were watching them burn from before noon today. They've tried to get up into the buildings next to them to get streams of water onto them. But they're still having an awful lot of trouble with that heat, and the heat also in the very center of the base of where the two trade towers were. You can probably see some of the smoke down at the end of the street, very often obscuring what little of the wreckage we can see from here, the twisted wreckage. But the search and rescue operations are beginning to move around the periphery. We're beginning to see some of the rubble moved out by front-end loaders in some of the trucks. And every couple of hours, another shift of firemen comes past us, completely covered with dust.
And Bill, how quickly was the city and the National Guard, I'm assuming or supposing, how quickly were they able to get all of those bulldozers and backhoes that are so necessary to move this massive amount of wreckage?
We saw that all accumulating by late afternoon. I haven't myself seen any of the National Guard yet, but by late afternoon there were dozens of fire trucks, these enormous pieces of heavy machinery like the front-end loaders coming on trailers, some of them. They were all in position here in these side streets out behind where the trade towers stood not so long ago. And at first there was a bit of traffic jam out here and real gridlock as the men in charge of coordinating all of this effort tried to figure out how to get things into position. But that's all been cleared up pretty much now. They closed down the city completely. There's also no electricity here except for the floodlights they've brought in. But there's certainly no civilian traffic here, so they finally have that under control. Of course, there's a very grim job ahead.
A grim job indeed, and it could be weeks. Thank you, Bill Blakemore, for that report down from lower Manhattan near ground zero of this. The Navy's Atlantic Fleet has sent aircraft carriers, guided missile cruisers, and destroyers into the waters off New York City and Washington, D.C. The Navy has also deployed a warship to patrol off the coast of Seattle. ABC's Neil Karlinski is there.
In Seattle, a Navy frigate armed with anti-aircraft weapons steamed into position near downtown in Elliott Bay. Throughout this city, life as normal simply stopped.
They came on and said that they were evacuating and please leave immediately.
Downtown, several buildings were evacuated. Even the city's famous Space Needle was closed indefinitely for fear it too could be a target. Children were kept in school, but the day was anything but normal as the smallest of students tried to understand what was happening. On the water, ferry service, on alert for car bombs, stopped service to all but individual passengers.
I asked the American people to join me
Many of those who saw the images before leaving for work this morning, like this woman, stayed home, disgusted by the pictures before them.
I just woke up to it. I mean, it's unbelievable. I can't believe it. I have so many friends in New York, and it's just...
It's going to be a couple of minutes. We'll be over to help you, okay?
Others, desperate to help any way possible, simply flooded blood banks.
I had to do something.
For that report, we now have some home video, we are told, of the first plane hitting the first, you see it there, hitting the first tower at the World Trade Center. Cameras were, after this first explosion, cameras were trained on the Twin Towers when the second jet slammed into it. So that was the jet. The second, we've been seeing all day long, the second commercial jet slam into the second tower. That was just home video of the first one. We'll look at that one more time. You can see it heading straight for the tower. If we can re-rack that, please. Thank you. Home video just happened to be down there, happened to be rolling, and captured what is, even as we replay this, and we've seen this video twice. This video is the first time we're seeing this, but we've seen pictures, images of these jets crashing into the tower for hours now, and it is still an incredibly disturbing and upsetting sight to see. Again, those pictures just into our newsroom here of the very first wave of this unprecedented terrorist attack that has been launched here on the United States. We have been tracking this evening public reaction to the attacks throughout the day, and joining me now is ABC News polling director Gary Langer. What are you finding out as far as reaction? I mean, are people shaken, obviously disturbed and upset?
I think so. Elizabeth, at times of crisis, Americans tend to express both concern and resolve alike, if you will, and I think we're seeing both of those now. Nearly 9 in 10 Americans are worried about the chance of more major terrorist attacks of this nature. Indeed, half the public is very worried about it. Nearly half worry that they personally could be the victim of this kind of attack, or someone close to them maybe. Now, despite these concerns, we find that about 2/3 express at least some confidence that the government can deter or prevent these kinds of attacks, and 2/3 also express a willingness to suspend some personal liberties in order to help the fight against terrorism.
That's an interesting one, because we've been talking already with some of our other reporters around Washington, D.C., for example, earlier to Lisa Stark out in Seattle, Washington, about the fact that this could change the way Americans fly. We've all become very accustomed to checking luggage at curbs and dashing in and out of airports. Could we be looking at something like El Al security, and is the way Americans fly? We've all become very accustomed to checking luggage at curbs and dashing in and out of airports. Could we be looking at something like El Al security, and is the American public willing to put up with that in massive inconvenience?
We do show some acceptance of that at this point, based in part upon concern over how this occurred. The public divides almost evenly on whether the authorities did all they reasonably could to prevent this or not. Now, nonetheless, now with this having happened, around 9 in 10 express at least some confidence that those responsible will be caught and punished. And also, we find that vast majorities, again, around 9 in 10 Americans, say they support military action against groups or nations found to be responsible, even if that means going to war.
It's interesting, that 91% figure, because in other cases of attacks, it actually hasn't been very easy for the United States government to figure out who was behind them and to bring those people to justice.
In this poll, even 54% are even very confident that those responsible can be found and caught. Now, there's some rallying around the flag there that you're going to find. There's broad concern and also resolve. Another interesting result, I think, is the remarkable extent to which these attacks have really focused the nation's attention. 99% of adults, basically everyone, have watched or listened to broadcast reports of this event. 91% say they prayed for the families or the victims. 4 in 10 employed people across the country left work early or didn't go to work today. Nearly 3 in 10 Americans, over 50 million people, say they called or emailed a friend or a relative in New York or Washington to see if they were okay.
Indeed, the frantic sort of reaching out to see if loved ones, people you care about, are in fact involved or may have been victimized in some way.
Completely across America.
It's so interesting to see yet again how something like this, a tragedy on this scale, really becomes a uniting thing or factor for this country. People all over sort of sitting down watching and in horror as this all unfolded.
It's quite remarkable how it is utterly and completely focused and commanded the nation's attention and then created these really nearly unanimous views in terms of actions the government can and should take.
All right, Gary Langer, thanks for that polling data. We're going to very quickly update you as we take a look at some new pictures from this evening for rescue workers. It's been another long and difficult day. They have converged by the dozens at the site of the World Trade Center to look for survivors and bodies amid the rubble of the Trade Center's twin towers. Both towers struck by two hijacked commercial jets, both towers collapsing a short time thereafter. Some 300 firefighters are believed among the victims. They were in the towers trying to evacuate them. Some 50,000 people work in those Trade Center towers every day. We don't know how many they were able to evacuate or not, but 300 firefighters we know were in the process of doing just that, and they are feared dead, killed, also victims in this. Officials say it could be weeks before we know the final death toll. Crews are also on the scene at the Pentagon, where another hijacked jetliner slammed into that building yesterday. There has been no credible claim of responsibility for the attacks orchestrated here in New York or in Washington, D.C. at this point. Whoever was behind it managed to pull off an incredibly well-orchestrated and devastatingly effective act of terrorism. But officials say suspected terrorist mastermind Osama bin Laden is a prime suspect. We have here, just to our desk, a report from the Boston Herald saying that authorities in Massachusetts have identified at least 5 Arab men as potential suspects in the terror attacks launched yesterday morning from Logan International Airport. They apparently have seized in the central parking garage a car laden with Arabic language flight training manuals. Of course, there's been a lot of speculation that whoever hijacked these airplanes needed to know how to fly them, being unable to convince any sane pilot to deliberately fly his commercial jet into a landmark, the Pentagon, the Trade Center towers. Also, there apparently, the sources in this Boston Herald report are saying that hijackers in one plane began to kill flight attendants on board the flight in order to lure the pilot out of the cockpit. At that point, they were able to then go into the cockpit and take control of the aircraft. Apparently, according to the source, they started killing stewardesses as a diversion. The pilot came back to help, and that's how they got into the cockpit, according to this Boston Herald report. Also, according to that report, the suspects did all of this on all 4 of the flights that you're seeing right there, 2 American Airlines flights, 2 United Airlines flights, all originating here on the East Coast from Boston, Logan Airport, from Dulles Airport, from Newark Airport, all heading to California, all heavy with fuel, airline fuel, and apparently, according to the Boston Herald report, the suspects used knives that they had hidden in their shaving kits and other carry-on luggage. And that was how they were able to smuggle these weapons on board. No guns were used, but apparently the knife-like weapons were made up of plastic handles embedded with razor blade, according to sources in this Boston Herald report. Indeed, authorities were led to the rental car by a civilian who apparently said got into some sort of an altercation with these suspects, with several Arab men as they were parking their car, which was apparently some sort of sedan. The man, whose name was not available last night, called state police from an out-of-town airport to report that he had gotten into this argument with these suspects to check out the car. They, in fact, did, and found this Arab language literature as well as training manuals. 2 of the suspects, 2 of the men apparently, whose passports were traced to the United Arab Emirates, are brothers, according to this report, one of whom was a trained pilot. That's all in the Boston Herald. Obviously something, this is a huge crime investigation being launched right now. Federal agents going over the flight manifests on all 4 of these commercial jets, trying to figure out who on board was in fact beyond this, trying to trace this back to the source. Lower Manhattan and the Pentagon, an enormous crime scene as well as the scene of an enormous tragedy of historic proportions. I want to bring you up to date with some more information we're gleaning from this Boston Herald article, which quotes unnamed sources as saying that 5 Arab suspects have now been listed as 5 Arab men have been listed as suspects in yesterday's terrorist attacks. 2 of them brothers who were both on board United Airlines Flight 175. It was en route from Logan's Boston International Airport to Los Angeles. It was the second jet to slam into one of the 2 towers at the World Trade Center this morning. Apparently, another airline passenger at the Boston airport got into an argument with the men when they were parking their car at the airport. And when he heard after landing in another city about what had happened, called the FBI, said, I think you need to check this out. The FBI has apparently seized the car. It was a rental car that was reportedly being driven by these suspects, several Arab men. And inside they have reported to have found Arab language flight training manuals. One of the 2 brothers who was on board United Airlines Flight 175 was apparently a trained pilot. There's been a lot of speculation that whoever was behind these hijackings needed to know how to fly this plane. In this article as well are more details that apparently, according to sources, the hijackers began to kill flight attendants on board the plane so as to lure the pilot out of the cockpit, to get him to leave the cockpit, come back into the plane to try and restore some order, and that is the point at which hijackers took control of the cockpit. Several flight attendants were able to call, several passengers were able to call on cell phones, and in addition we're being told that at least one pilot in the cockpit was able to depress his key so that people in the air traffic control tower could hear everything that was going on in the cockpit at the time. They report the hijackers were in fact speaking English to the pilot, reassuring him not to do anything foolish. You're not going to get hurt, which of course was most definitely not the case. And finally, Robert Fitzpatrick, a former second in command of the FBI's Boston office, says that Boston appears to have been the staging area for this attack on New York City and in Washington, D.C., and that the hijackers most likely had help from others who may still be in the Boston area. According to Fitzpatrick, a quote, there is a terrorist cell operating out of Boston. So once again, to recap, we have rescuers down in Lower Manhattan still working, trying to get people from under that rubble. An exhausting and delicate and dangerous task. Many of the buildings there are still considered unstable. Fires still burning. There have been a few survivors pulled from the rubble, pulled from the wreckage after those 2 twin towers collapsed, and then a 3rd building yesterday afternoon also collapsing. But at this point, we have absolutely no handle on how many people may have been hurt or killed in this devastating attack. Suffice it to say that the casualties will be massive, as Mayor Giuliani put it here in New York City, more than any of us can bear. Among the casualties, more than 300 firefighters who were trying to evacuate the area. You can see Lower Manhattan it looks like a war zone. It's nothing like it. No electricity. It's being lit by emergency floodlights as crews put in enormous hours for this tremendously difficult task of sorting through the wreckage and the rubble there. While they're doing that, the similar work is going on at the Pentagon, which is still burning at this hour. Flames, in fact, keeping many people from being able to get in and unearth the victims there. Jim Sciutto, ABC's Jim Sciutto, is standing outside there. Jim, any progress on extinguishing the flames at the Pentagon?
We have not seen flames come out of the top of the roof of the Pentagon for quite some time now. As I said a couple of hours ago, what the firemen are doing is called trenching on the roof of the building, where they physically break it open to get access to the flames, but that causes them to jump up because the flames get more oxygen to feed on. But we haven't seen that for quite some time, although they are still, as you can see, spraying the building with water.
And in fact, as they do this, as they extinguish these flames, and as they hope to eventually begin to search for the victims buried there, work continues in the Pentagon. Very important work.
Absolutely. Work continuing in the National Military Command Center, where we don't know that he's left, but until a short time ago, we know that Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was there with no plans to leave, although we can't confirm that he is still there. That is kind of the headquarters for the military in a situation like this. I can tell you that they actually activated a crisis action in that National Military Command Center even before the plane crashed here at the Pentagon. Once they had word of the first plane hitting one of the World Trade Center towers in New York, they were in a crisis mode here, and then of course a plane hit them, although they're on the other side of the building. We also spoke earlier with other offices in the Pentagon that had hundreds of people at work as we speak.
Jim, I know that you're outside the Pentagon being kept at some distance away because it is obviously a crime scene, a scene of great tragedy, but have you been able to get any information on when, for example, those ships that were sent to come patrol off the coast of New York City, off Washington, D.C., when those aircraft carriers might be arriving?
We just know that they have left. The USS Comfort, a hospital ship out of Baltimore, on its way, and also the aircraft carrier you mentioned on its way as well, but we don't know when they're going to arrive.
All right, Jim Sciutto, thank you so much. Already in lower Manhattan, they have been taking many of the victims. There are all sorts of triage areas, MASH units. Many victims are being ferried from the lower Manhattan over to New Jersey, where they're receiving care there. But obviously, with the massive number of victims and the temporary morgue being set up for the massive number of casualties expected, this is a huge, titanic, logistical nightmare as well for these rescuers who are trying to do so much. Just a few moments ago, we were listening to former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger talk about the swift and severe response. My colleague, ABC's Derek McGinty, is joining me now. Derek, you've been perusing some of these editorials in different newspapers. Strong language there, too.
Indeed. It seems as though the spirit of what Lawrence Eagleburger spoke of, the need to strike back and the need to be very tough and the need to realize that this is not something you can wait for the international legal organizations to deal with, is the spirit especially found in, for example, the Washington Post editorial, which says basically if the attack originated abroad, it is an act of war. Some have even said in that editorial that war should be declared by the U.S. Congress if they can find the nerve to do that. It's the kind of thing where, again, if you look in the historical analog of how we've handled these things in the past, we've sort of waited for the legal system to take its course. For example, with the 2 Libyans that were recently convicted in the bombing of the plane over Lockerbie, they're basically saying that's not enough anymore. If we're going to act, we have to act quickly, and we have to make people know, as Lawrence Eagleburger said, there's a price to be paid when you do these sort of things, and that America has the will to act, and that's what the editorial is saying.
And in fact, as mirroring other comments, which has said any countries harboring this terrorist, i.e. Afghanistan, will bear the consequences of this as well. This is not just an attack on, if, for example, Osama bin Laden was deemed responsible for this, it wouldn't be just retaliation to his cell, but to Afghanistan or any other country sheltering the terrorists.
In fact, the President Bush did hint at this in the speech he made tonight, where he said, we will treat the countries that harbor these people the same as we treat these people. I think, as Peter Jennings said so many times earlier, we can't jump to conclusions. We don't know exactly who did this. We don't even know that it was Osama bin Laden, though the evidence seems to point more and more in that direction. But